All right, ladies and gentlemen, we're just up here sharing food because George David's got the best snacks.
This is what happens, right?
Yeah, it's the guy who goes out for lunch gets the best. What do you got? You got like a teriyaki chicken box and the edamame. Yeah, never said. And I was gonna say we bought you lunch, but you bought your own lunch. Just so as you know, anyone out there keeping track of the ethics stuff, Vlad, he bought his own lunch.
That makes me look bad.
We won't tell. It's less than $14.99 value. Ladies and gentlemen, I am delighted to be hosting this next panel, luncheon discussion, because I think it's gonna be fun and it's gonna be quite lively. We've brought in some old friends and some new friends. Sitting to my far left is RJ Robert Johnson, who is sorry, I'm not reading this correctly, RJ. Are you the CEO or COO?
CEO.
CEO of Eurasia Group, a tiny little consulting and thinking organization you've heard of across town. What you didn't know is it is actually run by a Canadian. Woohoo! RJ is you're a graduate of McMaster, RJ. Are you from Ontario?
I am, yep.
And yet you're an energy specialist. How did that happen?
I'm from rural Ontario, so it's closer.
and a free marketeer. RJ is also a friend of the Canada Institute. He's been a great source of information, inspiration, and good advice over the years. So we're delighted to have him. We have a new friend sitting to his left, George David Banks, who's a former special assistant to President Trump on international energy and environment, and is currently executive vice president for the American Council for Capital Formation.
Yes.
And you're going to tell us what that is.
By the way, for the connection.
Oh, yeah, you got a Canadian connection?
Yes, Quebecois.
You're a Quebecois.
Right, 1653. There you go.
And what was the ancestor's name?
There's a plaque downtown celebrating some of the first settlers and my great whatever grandpa's on there.
Was it a Banks or was it another name?
Oh, Uno.
Okay.
Not Banks.
Could have been. Bonk. Well, good. Welcome. It's nice to have another another Canadian. So we got a full complement of Canadians here. Tristan Goodman, who you've already met, executive vice president.
Senior vice president.
Senior vice president. That sounds even better.
Makes a difference.
Yeah, senior vice president of the Alberta Energy Regulator, which you have heard me say is the only regulator I've ever met where people use words like agile and nimble and responsive. So I don't know how you do it, but keep on doing it. So we're going to go have a bit of a discussion of markets first, and then we're going to talk about what the heck we can expect from the Trump administration and what's happening in the White House. And then we're going to put the cap on it is how does regulation, good regulatory practice fit into everything we've heard. So over to my far left, RJ, how's the energy sector doing? Should I be selling my stocks or?
Past performance doesn't guarantee future results. Is this on? Just making sure.
Yeah, we don't have the light anymore. I think we forgot to pay that bill, so the microphone works, but there's no longer a light telling you it's on. And the camera is on?
Yeah, it's on.
We are recording, but we are not broadcasting. How's that? It might ultimately be broadcast.
It'll go up on the website.
It will go up on the website, so there you go.
Great. Well, we'll try to make some clip-worthy comments here.
Okay.
Well, I think on the oil and gas side, the oil picture obviously is very bullish, and I think part of me says in the last 20 years I've been doing this, pretty much every May, with the exception maybe of 2009 and 2014, is bullish because we have seasonal strong demand in the U.S. It just seems to be the seasonality in the market. People are looking at OPEC meetings coming up in June and all those kind of things. But there's always some additional nuance. And, of course, this year we have a lot of geopolitical risk that's come back in. And there's probably a debate in the market of has the market already discounted the possibility of an end to the JCPOA and snapback sanctions coming into place? How much more downside is there in Venezuela? And then how does that impact the current OPEC, non-OPEC agreement on production restraint? All of it suggests that we probably will need prices to stay at this level or a little bit higher over the next 12 to 18 months. And I say that because I think that some of that geopolitical risk will materialize and disrupt supply. I think that the OPEC-Russia agreement will survive well into 2019, and I think that really is in the interest of the Saudis, given not just the Aramco IPO, but also the possible succession of King Salman with MBS. And then I also think there's another more simple issue, which is that in order to really balance the market and get enough supply online to continue meeting demand, I think we just need prices at this level. I think you need to see an incentive for industry to drill, moving outside the Permian into higher cost shale plays in the U.S., trying to get some deep water going, trying to get some oil sands going. So it feels to me that over the next 2 or 3 years, we're more likely to be above 60 than below it, and more likely to test 80 than 40. But I'm usually wrong, so take that with a grain of salt. Then on top of that, there's a more interesting medium-term question, which is this debate about peak demand and sort of electric vehicles and alternative transportation, and what is the timing and extent of that. And in some ways, that's sort of an abstract long-term issue, and is the peak in 2035 or 2055. But it does have a very short-term relevant impact, which is that it's something that the industry is already grappling with, right? It's not so much important for shale investment because the shale investments are short cycle and they pay off in kind of 3 or 4 years. But companies that are committing capital to longer cycle projects that have a 30 or 40 year payout, these questions about long-term oil demand are quite important. And I think the market is extremely negative. The equity market is extremely negative on long cycle, and really doesn't want industry to invest in projects that may be harmed by a stranded asset scenario or unburnable carbon scenario or peak demand scenario. So that actually makes things tighter in the short term because we're just not getting the investment, right? So the Saudis are saying that maybe higher prices will push more incentive, but the companies are saying, well, we've been burned on that before, right? Trying to chase the market and stretch the limits of what we can produce profitably. So I'd say it's a very challenging time for industry and a very challenging time for the oil markets. But net, I would expect to see prices stay pretty strong over the next couple of years. On the natural gas side, interesting situation here. And I know David, I'm sure will have a lot to say about this, but I think my sense is that the U.S. LNG story, I think, is still generally a story of energy dominance. But I do think that the uncertainty on trade and the uncertainty on the Asia relationship has created a little bit of a headwind, and perhaps for some a large headwind. It's still a better bet than most other places around the world, so we don't want to lose sight of that. But I think the uncertainty about the tariffs on importing some of the steel and finished goods for LNG, and then the confidence level that Asian buyers will have in signing long-term deals with U.S. LNG, given the current administration's stance on things like the Korea trade agreement, obviously the relationship with China. I think the deals will still get done, but there's a little bit more complication now than there was in the past. That may be opening a window for Canada to some degree to see maybe the British Columbia LNG move forward in that context. May open the window for Mexico or for other parts around the world. But the basic picture is not changing in terms of an abundance of U.S. natural gas production, not just from the Marcellus, but increasingly from the Permian Basin, the associated gas that's coming with all the oil production down there, which really has nowhere to go other than LNG or to Mexico. And I think both of those have been complicated by trade. The last thing I would say on gas is that I mentioned the long-term demand questions in oil. I think the long-term demand picture for natural gas is a lot more bullish, and I think the industry investment patterns reflect that. But there's some important policy questions there in terms of Asian countries, particularly in Southeast Asia and India, and their energy transition. How much of a role will gas play? And I think that's the uncertainty, not so much the supply side, much more the demand side for LNG that we're looking at.
Thanks. Just a quick follow-up question, RJ. You talk to a lot of businesses, a lot of industry representatives all over the world. How much of a factor is regulatory burden in their decisions to invest or expand? And what, in particular, if that's a factor, what regulatory burden is most burdensome?
Yeah, we do have that conversation a lot, and I think it kind of goes back and forth, right? That in times like 2007 and 2011, 2012, when markets were extremely strong, I think industry's tolerance for complicated and long regulatory process was higher because there's just more capital being forced through the pipeline and into projects. Now, when the bias is towards returning money to shareholders or investing in less risky projects or fewer projects, there's almost no tolerance.
Yeah.
So anything that looks complicated or has execution risk in terms of permitting, I think generally industry is staying away from. And again, that's an advantage that we have with the Permian, is that there's really no regulatory risk whatsoever down there. And, very few places can say that.
Mm-hmm.
So I would say at this point, the governments that are moving away from complicated and, time-consuming regulatory process and moving away from resource nationalism are likely to be the ones that get investment. The ones that are choosing now as a time to experiment with new regulatory process or having extended reviews are going to suffer. And I think that that's quite interesting in the context of Canada, Mexico, and Brazil in particular. Right? Mexico, of course, has been opening up the last 3 years. I'm sure you talked about this already this morning. Now, with the election, there's a lot more uncertainty there and the possibility of a re-regulation or at least a look at it, which will slow things down. Brazil has been moving towards opening up as well, but again, there's an election there that's probably a little bit more market-friendly. And then in Canada, as we know, both at the federal and provincial level, there's a lot of uncertainty that I'm sure Tristan can talk about in terms of not just existing regulatory process, but also new layers being introduced as well, which in my opinion is very ill-timed, given how hyper-competitive the market is right now for attracting upstream capital.
Great, thanks. All right, Mr. Banks, we've established your Quebecois heritage. What we haven't established to my satisfaction, which being the chair is really embarrassing. Is it George? Is it David? Is it George David?
It's a Southern thing. We go by our middle names.
Okay, but you have two first names anyway.
It's confusing, I know.
Okay, so I'm going to call you David.
By the way, I recognize it was an advantage. So when I was at CIA, and first, I think this first personnel meeting, I'd been there for a few weeks. They were around the table, and someone said, "Hey, we just hired this guy named George Banks." And then someone else said, "Well, we hired David Banks." I wonder if they're related.
Related
It
cousins.
took them probably 5 minutes to figure out it was the same person. At that point, I was like, I got to stick with this.
A man of mystery, indeed. All right, David. So you worked for this administration. You have a strong sense of where they are, where they're going. Well, we discussed this morning a little bit about NAFTA. I do trade stuff primarily, and on the NAFTA, you all are a bit of a handful. But it is surprising that if we look at oil and gas and the direction of regulation with the Trump administration, it's actually very friendly to a lot of Canadian and Mexican interests. So if you can give us some background and some insight as to where the administration is and where they're going, that'd be really helpful.
Absolutely, my pleasure. Now, Hector, don't get bored. We talked about this this morning. This is kind of the North American energy bay for me, right? But look, a few things to note here. And we get. I always feel compelled to talk about energy dominance a little bit and explain what it means, because a lot of people have questions about it, and I've had folks look at me and go, "Oh, what? That sounds really ominous, right? Are you trying to control things?" Like, no. Look, there's kind of there's the political, there's the political statement there, and then there's kind of the policy realities, and everyone in the policy space recognizes that it's really a North American energy market, and when we're talking about energy dominance, and that really is, at least, from our perspective, it's on the domestic side, it's about, hey, you know what, and this goes back to the regulatory piece. We're going to do whatever we can on the regulatory side, roll back regulations, et cetera, in order to maximize the amount of production and exploit the U.S. abundance in energy wealth as much as possible to develop a competitive advantage, right, based on affordable and reliable energy, right? So there's kind of a merger, at least on the energy policy side. The trade pieces are certainly an important part of that. Okay, but then again, so when you're looking at foreign policy, right, and what does that mean? Or it really means, look, it's in our interest to promote open, competitive energy markets. It's in our interest to promote universal access to affordable, reliable energy, and it's certainly in our interest to help promote security of global energy supply, help our allies, help our partners. And then when we're thinking about that, we just really can't separate the U.S. from Canada and Mexico, right? From a kind of that foreign policy perspective, I personally, and a lot of my friends in the administration, we think it's important that we share a common vision. It's a little hard with Canada because of the climate piece. You know, it's hard for us just to talk about energy security without, you know, also, you know, talking about climate. But you know, you know, in many ways, we already have, you know, a shared vision in a lot of pieces of this. And I think with Mexico, I think Mexico and the United States could benefit significantly, you know, with, you know, this continued push for a common shared strategic vision and the role of energy, not only between both countries and on the continent, but sort of globally as well. But I am on this trade piece, by the way. I think it's an interesting topic. Just a couple of observations. I'm not really concerned about the energy piece getting tangled up in the trade negotiations. So I've worked on the NAFTA piece a little. You know, we certainly really push to compartmentalize, you know, that as much as possible, and to do what we could to protect and to advance sort of the accelerated integration of the market.
Yep.
I can't speak for my trade negotiating friends, but that's at least on the energy policy side. That's where it is, and I think that for U.S. LNG, I think it's more of a case of just is it competitive, right, in these markets. You know, maybe it has maybe if the trade negotiations go the wrong way, then you have a political fallout where you lose the premium that some countries and entities might be willing to pay for U.S. gas. I think the wild card, and look, by the way, I think the current trajectory domestically and with the foreign policy side of this is that it's on autopilot, right? I think energy's easy for this administration, as you can guess. There's a consensus across the administration as to how to play energy as a foreign policy tool, and how important energy is to the domestic economy. Having said that, you know, there's always a chance that, you know, by the way, in case you didn't know, there's a lot of turnover.
I hadn't noticed. Rachel Maddow has
Just in
3
case.
walls.
You know, I can't assume that you guys are keeping that close of an eye on us, right? But so you can't assume that you won't have someone come into the White House who comes at it from an economic nationalism perspective, and you know, and then they support some of the arguments, for example, that are promoted by Dow and a few other energy-intensive companies here, saying, hey, you know, why are we exporting all this? Let's keep some of this back, right? Because the president's goal is to not only resurrect but reinforce U.S. manufacturing. This is the right policy. So you could have a development like that. And then, you know, one of the points that I love to talk about now is at some point, you know, you might have, the president's not ideological on climate change. So you might have a situation where, let's say they go through all these iterations, you know, and figure out, you know, tariffs aren't the answer, right? And we have to figure out how to operate within the existing framework, except, you know, in other ways, right? Then they could look at sort of the climate environment agenda as being a potential sweet spot to gain a competitive advantage vis-a-vis more carbon-intensive economies. Okay. Now, we would have to find a common understanding with our friends and allies who are less carbon-intensive than us, right? But I do think, you know, if I got a crystal ball out about, you know, where climate policy is headed in the United States, I think that's where Republicans and Democrats will finally end up, is kind of embracing sort of a merger of those policies. And then the difference will be, you know, what are we talking about as far as reductions? Is there like carbon regulation, or is it just a pure play and with what we already have?
That's really interesting. That's really, you know, that we could actually see a 180 from where we think U.S. is on climate.
Let's say 180.
Okay.
180 would imply.
Non-ideological. I like the way you put
Yes,
that.
I would. A 180 would imply, but the president would say, let's have this, major carbon regulation or legislation that would result in deep emissions cuts. Compete against Canada for emissions cuts. That's not going to happen.
Okay. But you might say we're good at this. We're good at this stuff, and we're better than some other guys are.
Look, the argument that I make is that we don't have to push through carbon regulation or legislation because we already have a less carbon-intensive economy than the competitors that people talk about, right? Putting Japan aside.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, so if you look at our emissions trajectory, I mean, it's falling over time. So why not take advantage of that fact, right? It's a dance.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a 180. Maybe it's the 90.
Yeah, and it's not a full pirouette. Okay.
Is it 90? I don't know.
Interesting.
I wasn't good at math.
Yeah. Interesting. Just one quick follow-up question, because you were talking about the NAFTA. When we collectively, North Americans, stripped out the Mexican exceptions from the energy chapter, there was a bunch of blank pages left there and one really obnoxious clause about proportional access, which is, if anybody's following, has been removed from the deal. So it's kind of an empty chapter. And we had heard that the Canadian side had heard that the U.S. didn't really want to do much with that bunch of empty pages because you didn't want to drag in USTR and congressional trade committees to be supervising the behavior and activities of the energy sector. But then some other folks said, yeah, but maybe you could write in some best practices cooperation on energy regulation and permitting and safety. And what's your thinking on that? What was the trajectory out of the building up the street?
Well, I mean, so USTR has a different position on this. USTR, they'll make the arguments, but there's a sovereignty issue here. And then they're really sensitive to, and some of this energy, like the ISDS, right? It gets caught up in other parts of. It's not just energy that ISDS would affect. But this idea that we don't want to put anything in there that would create unnecessary or create incentives for people to invest in Canada and Mexico versus the United States, right? I just, we'll see where that ends up. I'm a strong believer in, personally, in having a really healthy chapter that accelerates the integration, helps accelerate the integration of the market.
Mm-hmm.
Look, I mean, we've said this. We've said it to the president. We said it to principals that you can't achieve. I said this morning. You can't achieve energy dominance unless North America, right, moves ahead, and it's a North American energy dominance play that we're really talking about when you're talking about global energy supply.
Yeah. And a great competitive advantage for North America if we start playing better together and stop shooting each other over the fence.
Well, we're not doing that yet.
Not yet. 1812, man.
Shooting seriously.
All right. It's a great segue into everybody's favorite energy regulator, about playing nice, but also about doing good regulation during challenging market conditions, challenging political conditions. Tristan, what do you want to talk about?
So I guess there's a few things, and I appreciate the comments from RJ and David. The reality is, maybe just starting at the top, in North America, it is integrated. Whether you want it to be or not, you've got pipes going across borders, you've got pricing, you've got landlock on natural gas. Oil, a little different. But the reality is, it's going to remain integrated. It would be cost prohibitive to try to remove that. So with that in mind, lots of positive to work from. So my comments are really going to be based off from a regulatory perspective, and then taking some of the very good work that a lot of people are doing here in Washington and elsewhere, and how do you actually practically put that into place to find some ways to have a regulator that actually is efficient, while not compromising some of those mandated issues that I think everybody is interested in. So a couple things. First, I'm looking at efficiency from a perspective, and I am very clear. In Alberta, we have a mandate to try to improve the efficiency. reduce some of that regulatory burden, that intervention in the marketplace. And there is a big but, while preserving that environmental protection and public safety. It is key, and there isn't sort of an ability to maneuver or compromise that. Maybe just before I get into sort of how you do that practically, a couple of key things. Times have changed, so I think there's a lot going on here, politically, socially, that you have to take into account. And it is important to recognize the hydrocarbon business is a marginal-based business. So 25 cents here on a barrel of oil, it makes a big difference. I've been in New York when capital moves in 2 hours, seeing billions and billions of dollars move. It can move at lightning speed, and it's quite thin where you go. So to think that, you know, one regulation will not have a difference is inaccurate. You've got to actually look at that, and it does take into account other factors internationally. So it's very important to think about this. If you say, well, I'm going to move this reg slightly up or slightly down, and it's just peanuts, those companies will tell you those are their peanuts, and they're very sensitive about their peanuts. So, and it's a reality. The other one, I guess, is around the fact that there is a bit of a transition occurring here, and there's a large debate, recognize that, over this energy transition space, the extent of how much that's occurring, when that's going to occur, all those factors. For myself and for our regulator, we're really interested in looking at recognition of that and making sure that that can be integrated. So if you look at modern plays in the US and elsewhere, Canada, Mexico, you're going to start to see a lot of increased renewables on those sites. You look at some of these big multinationals, worked for many of them, and the reality is they're starting to actually integrate this technology. So again, the key is around integration. Integration is also where you're going to find opportunities for collaboration. So, and one that wasn't discussed this morning that I just want to briefly touch on, it's because it hasn't come up, and it is, people are ignoring it, watch out. It's around data. You have a change going on internationally, and you can look to those companies. There is a lot of data out there, and this is not just your classic statistical analysis and where this is going. This is mass big data. Having autonomous systems, being able to make decisions and how to actually move in that space. Regulators need to get involved in that. The companies are already down that road. Their systems are set up already. They've invested. They're all plugged in. They use big data and AI to move in those spaces. So that's a factor we're going to have to consider. So the question really is, how do you sort of go about achieving regulatory efficiency? And there's different sort of mental models, if you want to call them that, but generally there's 3 areas that are useful to consider. The first is, and I think nothing I'm going to say here is overly surprising, but you've got to consider them. The first is decision timelines. If you have uncertainty in that decision process, or if you have extended timelines, you are messing up your net present value and your discount cash flow, which is, sorry folks, that's what people use to invest. So it is very important that the timelines are considered. And there's ways to go about dramatic reduction in timelines without compromising the reason that was put in. And I can speak to that if folks are interested. The other one is you've got to have the right regs for the right problems. It is about outcomes. It's not simply seeing a small problem. If as a regulator, there's no problem a regulator cannot solve without a new regulation. And that's a bit of an issue. You've got to watch. There are many other methods out there. You can seek performance through a non-regulatory intervention in that market. And that's a key piece. So you've got to look at what regs are in place to achieve the outcomes you're really after. And I think what you'll find, particularly in systems that are a little older, there's a lot of requirements built up. And often we're not talking about millions of dollars, you're talking about billions of dollars. And you are talking about, again, it's relevant because of that marginal unit component. These are slim margins in some cases, as RJ and others will know. And so it makes a difference if you move into that space without compromising what you're really after as a regulator and what your democracy is expecting of you. The final one, and it's much more difficult, is comprehensive transformation. And that's tough. But there are some success stories. And what I mean by that is, I can just give you a prime example, and I think that's probably the easiest way to go about this. If you want to drill a well in Alberta, you need about 32 different licenses from the Alberta Energy Regulator. So imagine if you want to drill 1,000 wells. You're going to need a lot of licenses. The problem is those licenses are all effectively trying to get at the same thing. What are you doing, company? Where are you going? How are you going to actually make sure you're achieving those outcomes that our society is interested in? So in our case, one of the things we're moving to is simply one application, one review, one decision. You bundle these things. You use automation and technology to do that. You look at those really high-risk activities, and you can automate those lower-risk components. And really, you can get dramatic reductions in timelines at the same time without any compromise on the other side, in our case, related to public safety and environmental protection. This wasn't initially easy, but once you break through and you manage to sort of get something in place, it goes to a bit of a cookie cutter. So it can just be templated out, and your costs can be reduced to implement. So I think those are really my main comments. There's probably a lot I could cover there, but that's sort of moving from RJ to David over to myself. Hopefully that flows into okay, how do you practically move into this space to do this?
Great. I have a sort of beginner's question. In terms of jurisdictional issues, I mean, we're talking about, one level, talking about the NAFTA, which is between national governments. Vlad this morning mentioned the Regulatory Cooperation Council, which is, again, between national governments, potentially bringing Mexico on board, which, in my opinion, is a really good idea, but still, we have always struggled with the fact that the RCC does not include sub-federal regulations. Here you are, a strong sub-federal regulator, working with, at least on an advisory or cooperative basis, a national regulator in the Mexican context. How important is jurisdiction either as an impediment or can you jump over the jurisdictional misfits and focus on functional capabilities? This is the issue. This is what we do. We're just going to focus on this. How much does that play a role in what you do?
Yeah, it's a good question, Laura. It actually, there isn't a lot of jurisdictional communication there, we find. It really is about the main issues. And if you're looking for opportunities to collaborate, you've got to find ways to collaborate first and foremost on things you're not competing on, because you're going to have a problem and it's just a standard piece. So an example would be every jurisdiction in the United States, at the federal and the state level, defines a well differently. Everyone does the same thing. It's a little easier actually in Mexico because there's a federal sort of structure there, as Carlos is aware. But in Canada, you have the same problem. It is amazingly inefficient to do that. And I'm not talking, a few $1 million. Huge sums of money, because everybody's defining these things differently, so all systems have to work differently. And this is what I mean by taking some of these concepts that are absolutely needed to sort of set a high-level policy framework, but when you move into the practical component of how do you make those things run, you've got to look for opportunities to collaborate on things where it makes natural sense for everybody in a North American context to get to that. That's just one example of where regulators can get together, and you'd be very surprised how those companies will respond, because their capital doesn't just stay in North America. We are not competing with one another. You're competing in a global context for that capital, particularly in the oil market. So that's relevant.
David, RJ, you guys are in the predictive soothsaying, fortune-telling business. We were talking about energy dominance. Can you just give me a 10 to 20-year view? What does the North American energy market or energy dominance picture look like globally? And what needs to happen policy-wise to ensure optimal outcomes?
I think I'd like to put a contrarian view out there, which is that peak demand doesn't necessarily mean the end of the so-called high-cost resources in Canada and the Gulf of Mexico, or even Alaska, for that matter. So I think that the general assumption is like, well, as oil demand plateaus and maybe starts to decline, say 20 years from now, there'll be less of a call on expensive barrels, and that part is true. But it's not necessarily true that, given the industrial base here and the quality of our companies and engineering and sort of downhole technologies, the quality of our regulation, the size of our markets, both consumer and capital markets, that just like we've seen shale producers drive down costs from $60 break-evens to mid-30s, low 40s, the same thing's happening in the oil sands. The same thing's happening in the Gulf of Mexico. So I think my 10 to 20-year view would be, the energy dominance is right. And leaving aside the sort of foreign policy and geopolitics for a second, elements of that, from a pure market perspective, I think capital would rather be in North America and rather make big bets on technology and take risk in that space. Like, I'm buying this resource that currently costs $45, but I think I see a way to get it to 40.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where my return is going to be. These companies are all run by engineers who like that kind of thing. They don't want to bet on, will Kurdistan be stable and therefore I can produce anything. So I think if Canada, Mexico, and the U.S. can consistently focus on that message, and I applaud the current administration for emphasizing the technology side of this, as I think is generally true in Canada as well, and increasingly in Mexico, capital will come, and I think it will be the dominant platform at a time when I would expect, if we do get a plateau in oil demand, it'll be much more damaging for the Persian Gulf and for Russia and for Africa than it will be for North America. And what we're seeing in Venezuela now will unfortunately probably replicate other places. So I think that's an important piece, but it only works if we have stable and efficient regulation and we have, a signal to capital markets that this is the place to invest, and this being North America as a whole.
David, what's your long view?
So I like that. I get on some specific policies. We've got to get we have to get the infrastructure piece right. Because if we don't get that right, we're going to have a lot of trouble. They're different. We've got different sort of infrastructure related challenges. In some, but I think one thing that, well, I'm not sure. I guess you would argue in Canada you have that you have some lack of infrastructure that you need, right?
I think we would argue that.
We would argue that. Just a little bit.
Just
yeah.
checking. Yeah,
Just checking.
okay.
Yeah, well, I think that the three countries would make that point. I know. I also think that look, we have to stay ahead of the curve on energy innovation. But it's more than just figuring out what the role of government is and what the R&D strategy is. There's also a trade component to it as well. Because we've got a situation where, if you look at Bill Gates, right? He's got this prototype advanced reactor that he's going to build in China, right? So we have a challenge where we innovate here, and then it's commercialized elsewhere. That's not good for energy dominance, okay? Because at some point you lose that base, right? If you're not actually building it and deploying it here. But then also I think that we do have to figure out this climate agenda, right? I don't exactly know what that looks like, but the shareholder activism is a major problem. And I think that here in the United States, we definitely need reforms, whether it's the SEC or whether more sort of their longer term legislative reforms. And I'm willing to bet that you probably kind of feel the same way in Canada, right? I'm willing to bet that we've got friends in Western Europe who feel the same way as well. But it does represent a threat, and and a lot of our enviro friends don't really recognize what it means in the grand scheme of things, right? They're scoring points and trying to get funding by kneecapping Chevron or Exxon or some of our champions when it comes to, and not just sort of presence globally, but also companies that spend a lot of money on energy innovation. And if you kneecap them, if you disadvantage them, then who do you have left? Well, you've got state-owned enterprises that don't really care about climate change and are not going to work with Sierra Club and NRDC, right? Sorry. Anyway, it's just a couple of thoughts.
Yeah, I mean, our friend from Brookings this morning, she had a great point, and I'm going to say it badly. I'm going to appropriate it for my own purposes. Is that there's lots of folks on the left and the right that have their religion, and that's fine. But the bigger problem is all the folks in the middle with the misinformation that are vulnerable to taking decisions in the wrong direction because they don't understand the implications of what they're talking about. Tristan. Does good regulatory policy transcend trends in the market? 10, 20 years out, is good regulation good regulation?
Yeah, so the answer is both yes and no. So the regulation you put in today, first, there are going to be some areas where you do need to have some prescriptive regulation, which is frustrating, it's difficult, and there's different ways you evaluate that. So there's no silver bullet on any of this, but in general, what regulators should be trying to do is they've got to move up into different things. They can't keep up. It's too costly from a staff perspective. It's too difficult. It stifles innovation. So you got to get to a point where you have more outcome-based requirements. And I don't mean that as a firm piece. There are times when you've got to use something that's a bit more specific. But as a general rule, you've got to be very careful that the market now is innovating at such a pace. The regulation you put out today, if it's prescriptive, is probably by the time you get it out, it's actually impeding innovation in the market, and it's making you uncompetitive. So you're going to have to realize, and there's different ways of doing this. Regulators actually are this is something actually our friends in Mexico and I have had conversations on, and the reality is there isn't a silver bullet. And different academics have different views. There's some very good work out there across all sorts of institutes and such forth, but there isn't a perfect win. I can say the one thing the regulators have to watch, in fact, most institutions have to watch, and this would be true, I'm sure, in the United States and in Mexico, is you've got to watch you always have credibility. If you lose that credibility piece, imagine if you did not have confidence, the people in this room, did not have confidence in the Supreme Courts in their countries. It's very, very important to maintain that legitimacy and credibility. And it doesn't mean you're going to always make decisions that everybody agrees with, but it does mean that you have to explain why you've reached those decisions and how you've accounted for the input that came in, even if you decided, nope, we don't agree with you. So credibility is pretty key in any regulatory piece, and I think it's often overlooked.
I am monopolizing these folks. They are super smart and super interesting. So questions or comments that are phrased in the form of a question? There's one now. Alan.
So I've been thinking about, when you were talking, I think Tristan, but others can jump in, on state regulatory in the U.S., but probably provincial as well, state and provincial regulatory heterogeneity on regulating the oil and gas sectors. So there was this nascent attempt a voluntary attempt to line up state regulations by this regulatory exchange, it's called, and but it really hasn't gotten far off the ground. So I just wonder about thoughts on this question, where every state's regulations are different, every province's regulations are different, and whether you're making more progress on that at the provincial level.
Sure. So I guess from an academic standpoint, I'm very interested in, and it's pretty hard to move against a more homogeneous piece across regulations, because obviously from a market perspective, it's very, very efficient. But as a regulator, a practicing regulator, the reality is it's not possible on some items. You have to recognize that you have different elected officials that are moving with different ideological perspectives, and those will show up in regulations. And that's okay, actually. There's nothing wrong with that. But if you can look for things where those ideological perspectives do not exist, but are causing either huge cost or they're not meeting an outcome. So an example would be, if you're looking at, you have interest in monitoring aspects of anthropogenic climate change, if you're in that. you're going to need data to do it. You also will need the exact same data to make your market efficient. Well, that's a sweet spot. So you're usually, what I've found in regulatory practice is you're going to have to look for things where there isn't that ideological component, but there is large cost or great interest from related to an outcome that people are wanting. So that's where I think you can get a lot of bang for your buck. Once you get that, and we have achieved some of that in Canada, I'm certainly not saying we've cracked the nut, we haven't, but we're further ahead than we were, say, 10 years ago.
Bonko, you had the next question.
I'm going to warn about hidden regulation, not here so much on oil and gas, but when I was an FARC commissioner back in the 90s, we had about 1,300 people on staff regulating the entire wholesale market. Right now, there are maybe an additional 8,000 regulators. If you add up the staffs of the PJM, all of the regional transmission organizations, the North American Energy Standards Board, there's about 8,000 employees there regulating what are supposed to be competitive markets, which we're still trying to figure out what they are. So my concern would be something like converting the NEB to the CER. Is that going to expand regulation? You're going to end up with more regulators. Remember the old television show, Yes Minister? The first rule of bureaucracy is keep all you have, not to mention the second rule, which is get more.
Great question.
I'm
That's all. No, please.
You sure? I actually, surprising, as a regulator, I actually agree. You have to be very, very careful. We are trained as regulators to regulate. And so if we have a hammer, we're running around looking for nails sometimes. So that's where I think strong leadership has got to come in. And that isn't the case. I don't think in the case of where the federal government is going in my country, I don't think you're going to end up with that. I think there's a genuine interest there to actually understand the concerns expressed on all sides and make that, get those good outcomes while getting that thing efficient. But the reality is you are going to have to consider and be very careful. There is a lot of regulators out there. There's probably 10,000 regulators in the United States, 3,000 in Canada. I'm not sure how many, but I'd imagine there's quite a few in Mexico. And just remember, we're not that old. So you've got the Chancery of the Exchequer in the UK. It's 1,000 years old. Regulators, they're like 1851 forward, and really they took off in the 1960s. So this practice is not sort of fully baked yet. It's still evolving. And I do think you're desperately trying to get those good outcomes, because that's what you're told to get from the democracy. They give you this piece of legislation. The issue is you've got to realize not everything needs a regulation. There's other ways to get there that are much cheaper, much more efficient. So, and it's funny, the Alberta Energy Regulator, by the way, is exactly the size of what you talked about. It's about 1,200 people. And yeah, so.
And by the way, I would echo what Laura said about AER being a very efficient and high-quality regulator, and hear that from clients all over the world. But unfortunately, I think your theory is what, if you look at the Canadian stock market and the performance of the energy sector, they basically have priced in your concerns, which is that this is going to become a more and more difficult place to do business. And it's not even about what's actually in the regulations. It's about two things. It's number one, that the trend is towards more. And number two, the process of even creating and explaining those regulations is seemingly open-ended. So capital is either leaving or sitting on its hands. And even though I'm supposed to be an independent, strictly neutral, nonpartisan Eurasia Group CEO, as a Canadian, it really saddens me, because when our own CEOs are telling their own shareholders this is a bad place to do business, that's really, really, really bad. I mean, you never hear that from Shell CEOs. I mean, I'm sure privately at the White House they would tell you, but they wouldn't stand in front of a microphone and say this is a horrible market.
Yeah.
And our government is hammering us every day. Well, not surprisingly, people sell the stocks.
Yeah.
Right. And now having said that, I think between now and the election, I think the current government realizes they have a mess in their hands, and they've got to get a better story around this, because it's gone from being we as Canada have problems in the oil sector and the oil sands specifically about market access to we are now a problematic business environment overall. Mm-hmm. And that's fixable, but we're in a bad spot right now, and I think you're put your finger on the issue. Nothing sinister, just kind of a no longer regulatory creep, but sort of an acceleration with no end in sight, which has really damaged the companies.
By the way, one of my theories, so you know, with Canada having the G7,
In Quebec,
yes,
Yeah.
yes,
your ancestral homeland.
yes, is that you know, there's been a lot of conversation about, you know, should we have a chair summary for an environment climate statement, or should it be, you know, negotiated? And if I'm in the current government, I'm gonna think, wow, do I want to pick a fight? Because you know, I mean, it's be a big fight with the U.S. coming up, and refusing to sign up to all this stuff, and then, you know, if it's someone like, you know, if it's someone like Scott Pruitt, if he's still there, right, and you know, he'll go on record and say this is destroying the Canadian economy. You know, we're doing so much better than you guys. You know how you know, you can just imagine it. And then they have to sort of try to square it in the press. The government does with kind of the current, you know, trouble. So it's a delicate dance in Canada.
You bet. Yeah, and I would be very skeptical if I saw a shared climate statement. What Canada has been doing in other areas is establishing a strong independent position, but being very careful not to cross wires with the Trump administration. You know, practicing the relationship that is cordial and cooperative, but not close necessarily.
Yeah.
I would just add, Rudy, again, a lot of this is federal, a lot at the Alberta level. I think the Alberta level is fine. And even in terms of substance and direction of the policies, I think most of the industry and most of the investors are on board with low carbon transition. This is really a lot more about process and communication.
Mhm.
The actual policies themselves are not extremely controversial. I mean, yes, we probably have under-consulted with our First Nations historically. We are moving towards the low carbon transition at some pace, right? There are real things here that we can grab onto, but the process itself seems open-ended, and the communications has been complicated.
But there is a difference between a low carbon transition and a zero carbon.
Agreed.
Right? I mean, I think that for us, I mean, we did this with the G7. We signed up to language saying we would transition to a lower carbon, you know, economy, which, you know, that's what we're doing anyway. But it's the numbers, and it's the degree of how much climate policy is defining energy policy around the world, and particularly in OECD, Western Europe, Canada now, right?
And to return to Tristan's point too, on the relative newness of regulation and regulators, would you say 1850? But the mandate for regulators is look after your domestic constituents. You have a domestic mandate, and make sure it's fulfilled. The notion that a regulator's mandate could include cross-border cooperation or economic competitiveness or trade advantages is very, very new and antithetical to the way a lot of regulators, present company accepted, are thinking. Ben, did I miss anything?
No, we got time for a couple more questions.
Okay. Well, I have a question while you think of your question. My question is, Mr. Banks, tell me, what is the American Council for Capital Formation? That sounds like a good thing. I'm pro-capital formation. I don't know anybody's against
It's a
it.
fancy way of saying pro-investment,
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
And it would be, you know, investment here, but also, look, I mean, we're pro-economic growth, no matter where it is. I mean, we believe that that poverty eradication and economic growth strategies should be, you know, a hefty component of U.S. foreign policy.
Cool.
So that's just, you know, we're you know, a small boutique business association here in D.C. With an affiliated think tank, mostly domestic economic policy.
Right. And we can look you up online. We can find the American Council for capitalformation.com.
Yes.
Everybody gets a good.
You know, I'm not that in the shadows. Okay. I'm a little somewhat transparent.
Yes.
I'll jump on that one.
Are you transparent too, Al?
Boy, I try hard to be. So, George David, what do you tell your members about how to embed climate risks or climate policy risks into their investment decisions?
so this question does come up,
Yeah.
right? Because people will ask me, how do you, where do you see things going with climate? Look, I think the Paris Agreement's a good framework. It's an improvement on, of the UN Framework Convention. There's no question about that. But oftentimes the biggest challenge that we have with climate policy making is that it's often divorced from economic and energy policy. All right, so it's not sort of based in sort of global energy realities. And if you've got a bunch of folks from environment ministries, hanging out with, their friends in the environmental community, well, I have some of them too, right? And they're fun to hang out with. But if they're just hanging out and talking about targets and how to be ambitious and blah, 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 without a real conversation about technology pathways, because this is really about innovation, right? And how do you develop, deploy, commercialize it? And it's a sector approach, it's a source approach, because it's more than just CO2. I do not see a politically viable pathway to achieve the kind of emission reductions that people talk about within the Framework Convention and the Paris Agreement. I think it's divorced from reality. And I don't think, I complain about shareholder activism. At some point, that's going to once retail investors figure out that these guys are taking actions that are detrimental to their own retirement funds, et cetera, I just think there's going to be a lot of brakes applied to a lot of that. And again, these companies can only do what they can do, and they're going to do what's in their interest, and the same way with countries. So I guess what I'm saying is I just don't see the climate mitigation agenda driving the types of finance, economic policies that people think is going to happen. Even if you have a scenario where you have major climate impacts, I just don't see it happening because there's political realities, economic reality, and then the climate agenda then becomes an adaptation agenda. That's where I see it.
I guess I would distinguish between two types of activism, and one of them actually isn't really activism. There's definitely like a strong, unburnable carbon activist community that's active in the asset management industry that's targeting the oil industry. That's still a pretty small force, although it's grown a lot. What's actually a far bigger problem, in my opinion, is just plain old vanilla, run-of-the-mill asset managers without any ideological agenda who now just see this as a risk. They don't care one way. It's like, I don't have an opinion. I don't know what's going to happen to the climate, but this is a risk that I now have to answer for. So I now have to tell the CEO and the board, show me your plan, right, for $500 ton carbon price or $250 or whatever it is. And guess what? The good news is all these companies now have those plans. And the market is sorting through to figure out, okay, who's actually going to be able to make money in that world and who isn't. I think it's a very healthy process. I like that process a lot more than some of the really top-down aggressive, because you said regulation's not the answer to everything. And this is a case where the market can push it from a risk management point of view in some potentially positive directions. But it is clouded by the fact that you have these more aggressive, stop producing oil now, we're going to sue you, all that stuff that's less constructive.
Well, and you've got BlackRock and Vanguard, the passive guys siding, right, and voting for these resolutions. That's very new.
Tristan, final words? Not necessarily on pricing climate risk, but
No, I think the key is going to be, as we move forward, there are opportunities for increased integration. It is an integrated market that we're in. I don't think things have changed there, and I look forward to the cooperation with colleagues and other sort of groups that can bring forward that information.
all right. Well, ladies and gentlemen, you're not going to want to miss the next session because Alberta Energy Regulator's secret sauce is going to be revealed. Paul and Shelley will give away all their secrets. So please join me. We're going to say thanks to these guys. We're going to stretch, and then we're going to sit back down.
Okay, thanks everyone for hanging around. These are the perils of throwing an event on a Friday afternoon when it's sunny and beautiful out. But I promise you, you don't want to miss this. And we're going to run through a quick presentation from the AR and open to some questions quickly from the audience. It's actually really my treat to be able to introduce Paul Forenzovich and Shelley Ewan, mainly because I'll just tell a quick personal story. When I was in grad school, I was working on taxi cab regulation and writing these this was when it was an interesting question. It's not an interesting question anymore. But I was writing these negative pieces about bad regulation that doesn't benefit the public, that, regulatory capture. And then my friend said, okay, you finished your degree, what are you going to do? And I said, well, I'm going to go work for the regulator. And so I went and I joined the Alberta Energy Regulator. And one of the very first things on my desk were, 4 things. It was just one piece of paper. We're going to be a protective regulator. We're going to be a credible regulator. We're going to be an effective regulator. But the thing that caught my eye is we're going to be an efficient regulator. And then so Paul, who leads up their senior corporate planning thing, he was a real kind of mentor for me because it was interesting. There was all these old regulations on the books. It was easy to get rid of some of the redundant ones, but he was kind of the first person who sort of said, well, yeah, we got rid of the low-hanging fruit. Why don't we get a ladder and try to reach up to some of the medium-hanging fruit and some of the even fruit at the top? And they did that at a time when they were erecting occasional fences that were making it harder to get fruit and stuff like that, but they were balancing really the trade-offs around energy and efficiency. And Shelley, I didn't get a chance to work with her that closely, but I will say she's from Maple Ridge, British Columbia, which, if you guys don't know, it's sort of the baseball capital of Canada. And they always get into the Little League World Series. So me growing up in Regina, Saskatchewan, I always said, oh, if I was only growing up in Maple Ridge, I could play for that Little League World Series team. So I'm going to hand it over to them. And Shelley's the director of the Integrated Application Decision Approach. And I think some of this technology really helps kind of square the circle around the problems that modern regulators are facing and how to be both efficient and protect the environment. So Paul and Shelley.
Thank you. Thanks, Ben, and Laura, thanks for inviting us. I think, as Ben mentioned, a lot of the discussion that we've heard today will align nicely with what we're going to talk about in terms of our transformative work on regulatory and business processes enabled by world-class technology that's award-winning. So it's interesting, as regulators, obviously, we're there to manage risks, and we do it obviously within legislative mandates. And one of the most important things is, as you've heard commonly, a regulator has to remain current, as was said here. We don't want to lose our social license. We've got to evolve over time, and we've got to be able to respond to the changing environment. And obviously, you want to do that in the best efficient manner, but you don't want to compromise your mandate. There is a lot of common themes that you'll see that will emerge through our presentation that were already raised today. Certainty of outcome, transparency, clear and understandable regulations, risk-based approach. All of those things you'll see, these are common foundational elements that are built into the one-stop platform. Obviously, as regulators, you want to remain current. You don't want to be institutionally irrelevant because, like I say, you'll disappear. And in our current environment, as Tristan mentioned, there are, when a person applicant comes in, he goes through a process where, he's getting 30 approvals, he's submitting data over and over again. It's not really efficient. So what we've also learned is that we've gone away from that well-to-well pipeline infrastructure approach that's really scattered. It doesn't allow us to see the cumulative impacts on the landscape. So we're noticing people are now coming in more on a project-based approach. They are planning. Our stakeholders want to see the whole big picture on the landscape. They want to understand our decision-making process, what goes into it. They want to see the transparency. They want us to unlock that black box. So, and they want to be involved. They are obviously very sophisticated, and that's just part of the societal evolution that we've gone through. So as part of that, when we move forward with respect to the regulatory change, we're on this transformative course that Tristan and others have mentioned, what we call an integrated decision-making approach. We want to look things at holistically. So we're talking about one application, one review, one decision. It's a risk-based approach where we want to look at the entire life cycle, not just a point in the life cycle. We want to ensure that we understand the information we're gathering, how it applies across the entire life cycle. Are we directing our resources to those high-risk activities that really need to be regulated? And we're doing that with what we call one-stop a technology that we adapted. And I got to say, it wasn't something that we just came up with yesterday. This has been a process that has evolved over 5 years. We're able to, with Tristan and others, executive top cover, we're able to purchase world-class technologies, make sure that architect them to a point where 80% of what we're doing is just configured. So we're not custom coding. And you heard stuff like flexibility, agility. You'll see that this platform provides that, because I can tell you, over my years as a regulator, when I talk to industry, our industry colleagues, the number one thing that they come back forth and they say, we want regulatory certainty of outcome. We want to understand that when we put something in, we're either going to get it approved or we're going to get it denied. So really, what we're going to tell you is a story about how this technology is really enabling transformative regulatory processes. Shelley, anything you want to add to that?
No, I don't think so. I think we go ahead.
Okay, so with that, I think we'll go to our a quick video, and then we'll just keep going through our storytelling.
Alberta has a rich history of oil and gas development. More than 100 years of this development has brought a lot of changes to our province. In the past, development was scattered across the landscape. From very remote locations to bustling communities, each project has different impacts on the environment and the people who live nearby.
The Alberta Energy Regulator, or the AER, reviews every proposed project and ensures all requirements are met before any decisions are made. Our job is to protect the public and the environment while ensuring economic benefits for all Albertans.
As our energy sector has evolved, projects have become larger and more complex. At the same time, Albertans' expectations have changed. They want more information about the projects that affect them.
And so the AER is moving forward. We are changing the way operators provide information about proposed projects and how we review and make decisions on energy development applications.
Today, the AER reviews applications for individual parts of an energy project. For example, a company might need to submit separate applications to drill a well, use storage tanks, build an access road, and put in a temporary pipeline to bring water during drilling. That's several different components of one project, each requiring one or more approvals.
Albertans from across the province have told us that this can be a frustrating experience. Local residents, municipalities, and Indigenous communities may receive several notices of applications for one energy project without knowing the end goal of the development. This can become even more complex when multiple projects occur in a specific area.
We're working on a new integrated approach, one that will see us review all aspects of a project in a single application, from start to finish, including how it will be built, how it will operate, and how and when it will eventually end with the land reclaimed.
To make this happen, many of our processes and systems need to change. This will take time, several years in fact, but when we achieve this goal, Albertans will be able to see the whole picture of a proposed energy project. It will be easier to find the project information and understand how a project may affect the environment and people who live nearby.
Why is this important? It allows us to improve our understanding of the full impact of an energy project and gather feedback from Albertans. This will help us make better decisions. We are talking to landowners, municipalities, Indigenous communities, and other Albertans to get their ideas on how this new approach could help them see the full scope of proposed projects and to explain how their questions and concerns will be addressed.
The result? We will manage the impacts of energy development in a more efficient way that considers all aspects of the project up front.
Over the past few years, we have tested and fine-tuned this integrated approach to energy development and the technology to support it. Our next step is to integrate pipeline applications and the information systems that receive them into one application, one review, one decision. To learn more, see the integrated pipeline application video or check out the Alberta Energy Regulator at aer.ca.
It's a pretty fancy clip.
So I'm going to continue to build out, sort of paint that picture of what the old way of thinking was. You heard earlier from both Kim and Tristan about the AER was formed 5 years ago. And so if you can imagine what was brought together, 3 different regulators, each with their own systems, each with their own processes. And so when we became the AER, industry then had to submit to various different places depending on which of the 32 applications they were applying for. So that was really part of the old way of thinking. It was disjointed, it was inefficient. Companies would submit piecemeal applications one at a time into some system that would feed one of various databases. And we then, as the regulator, would then, in isolation, review and make a decision on that one specific slice of the energy project. The new way of thinking, you've heard our sort of tagline, a single application, a single review, and a single decision. So that's really what our end goal is. So the new way of thinking is higher level, bigger picture, and possibly most important, what we would call a public notice. So rather than multiple times the public being sort of bombarded with these very small slivers of what is included in the energy development, they see that big picture and they get one notice explaining what that is, and then we interact at that level. For industry, it is absolutely more efficient. For the communities, it explains sort of what it actually is intended to be, what the activity is on the landscape. And overall, One Stop enables that integration piece. So again, looking at all the data, no matter where you are in the life cycle of that project, in the AER, you're looking at that same piece of data, which will eventually, once we build it up great enough, will lead us to better cumulative effects management.
So we think of One Stop as really revolutionary. I mean, when I think of a revolution, I think of something abrupt, something violent, and a complete change. One Stop certainly isn't violent, but I can tell you it's brought about a huge both change in the way we regulate the behavior of our industry. Also internally, it's really focused our work on the high-risk areas, the high-risk projects. So let's not kid ourselves. It's been a change management. Also, we've had to retrain some of our staff that are moving away from some of the administrative tasks into the more technically complex areas. We know, as Tristan mentioned, we're in an environment where capital moves across borders and it moves quickly. If you've got a regulatory environment that isn't responsive, it moves. So we do have a mandate recently to move on regulatory efficiency. One Stop is just one aspect of that. Again, I got to make it very clear that we're not compromising our environment, but what we're providing to industry and our stakeholders, again, is data that you only use once, data that's really used in the decision making. So we're not capturing data that's irrelevant or it sits there for years. We're using a system that's intuitive, it's easy to use, it's self-informed, it tells people how to walk through it. Again, it provides certainty because applicants are going to know when they file. They're going to know before they press the button, are they going down the path of routine or non-routine, high risk, low risk. So they know exactly. It also allows them to build out their applications before they get there. Obviously, it is about cost savings, both internally and externally to industry, to our own folks. We're in it, we're in a competitive environment, and we've got to emphasize that. So it is about time savings. It's about application turnaround. And at the same time, though, as we've heard over and over when we went out and consulted with folks on this, it is really ensuring that we continue with our mandate of public safety and environmental protection. So when we went out, when we were across the provinces, I would have thought, when you hear about streamlining, you hear about efficiencies, we thought that stakeholders, or at least I did it sometimes, we thought that stakeholders aren't going to really be receptive to this. But actually, when we started to explain to them about the benefits, about being able to see cumulative impacts, being able to be involved, starting to understand how we come to a decision. And Shelley and I will talk about our risk rules and how those are published on our website, so people understand how regulators are starting to make their decisions. It was a real win, and we've really got quite strong support across the province on this transformative work. So yeah, it is revolutionary, and there's a win for everybody. There's a win for government, there's a win for all of our stakeholders, and there's an internal win for efficiency. So it is a total package.
Can I interject just with a quick question? I think, so everyone kind of counts on industry to be the ones being innovative and efficient. And no one would argue that industry is not more efficient, more innovative than government, kind of on the whole. But that doesn't preclude government from taking steps like this to be innovative, efficient. But what was the actual motivation, or what was the push? Was that something internally from the AER? Was it an outside push? Or how to, because you've got to persuade your stakeholders and government that you're going to take a risk, you're going to invest in new technology that you think are going to deliver more efficient, better environmental outcomes. But how does that actually, because what we heard earlier today is there's a little bit of thumb twiddling from regulators on the process. How did you guys persuade your masters to do so?
Ben, can you back up a second? They said that there were 3 agencies were combined. Did that require a provincial law change, or?
The the Responsible Energy Development Act. We used to have.
What year was that?
2013. Yeah.
And what were the 3 prior agencies?
Alberta Environments, Sustainable Resource Development, and the Energy Resources Conservation Board, all with distinct mandates for the upstream oil and gas.
Prior to that, we managed upstream, but there were other elements, environmental jurisdiction, public lands, Water Act, that were held by other regulators. And as part of that competitiveness piece, when we were formed, it was to bring it all into one regulator.
I think to answer Ben's question, though, there was the political imperative and the political will to change, but there is also a lot of push internally to change, realizing what was coming down in terms of energy development, technological innovation, and also we work constantly with our stakeholders, whether it's industry and others. There's always that push-pull to change, and as a regulator, again, I want to make it clear that if you want to survive, you've got to have that will to change and accommodate things within your mandate.
Maybe just a comment for our colleagues in Mexico and the United States. It would be similar to taking FERC and then adding in parts of the EPA or others to really focus and hone on whatever you're really interested in regulating. So in our case, in Alberta, we had a focus on hydrocarbon development. And so we wanted to put everything in one shop and then make that more efficient while still sort of getting those outcomes. So that was the idea.
Maybe if I can just comment as well, while there was, the change and the AER was formed, it did take some really, I'd say, innovative, progressive thinking sort of at the leadership level to allow us to, first of all, to create sort of this opportunity, but also to test it and to be willing to take a little bit of risk and see what would happen in a safe space before we actually moved it out. So there's definitely strong leadership there as well.
I think there's 2 other pieces to what Shelley's saying. When we talk about a recipe for success, definitely it's top cover, but also it's really the ability of the operational folks, the regulatory folks to work with IT, because we've come to realize that if we want to stay in the game, regulators have to become digital, and pairing that business with the IT, that's what gives you really the strength and the power of what we're doing.
But anyway, sorry, I've kind of slowed down the process or the presentation by interjecting. I see a question there, but what's your preference? Do you want to do?
No, we'll take questions along the way.
Okay, yeah, and is it Martin or? Martin, yeah.
The competing mandate question, often the way regulatory agencies are divided because we don't want competing mandates within one regulatory agency. I assume that debate happened in Alberta. And in the United States, sometimes we split agencies, sometimes we combine them for efficiency. How did the competing mandate resolve debate? Or how was that resolved, or the consensus reached?
So the debate was ongoing, going way back to 1995. something called the McNichol report that said we need to amalgamate a lot of the ministries with the regulator to have a single regulator, a full life cycle regulator. That never really went anywhere. We had a subsequent UOGP report that again talked about the single regulator, getting those regulatory efficiencies. And it just evolved over time. And finally we got to a point where it was really the political driver and the whole thing about competitiveness that Tristan and others have talked to in enhancing assurance. And it was really ensuring that we're a competitive jurisdiction and having that political realization, and that's what drove it over the goal line. But it was a long debate over the years.
To that point, when we were formed, there was a lot of people that felt it was a conflicting mandate.
Yeah.
But I think what kind of saved our bacon on that one is we don't promote. We're not in the debate on hydrocarbon development. We exist because the government of Alberta has decided to develop this resource. Our job is to make sure it's safe, sufficient, environmentally responsible, and that there's economic benefit delivered back to Albertans as a result. So what we did, those transparency pieces, were first out of the gate to reassure Albertans that this new competitive, efficient regulator was not sacrificing the outcomes that meant a lot to them. And that took time. That's why you couldn't have done IDA in 2013. You could do it in 2017 because we were sitting on strong performance scores, strong confidence, and a citizenry that really trusted the regulator to do the right thing.
Okay, I want to see a few more slides because I sidetracked us, but.
So again, I'm not sure what's going to appear on the slide, but again, we've when we went into the transformation bit, obviously because we are a single regulator, we want to get there. We wanted to get away from old legacy multiple systems. We had dozens of them. And we want to transform it into one digital system where industry just submits their stuff and it's approved instead of going through multiple systems, having to re-enter the data multiple times. So again, as we're moving through the development of One Stop, we are retiring these legacy systems. Obviously, it was cumbersome, and at some time it still is cumbersome till we build out the entire system. We've probably got another 2 years to build out the entire life cycle from geophysical to reclamation and remediation. And like I say, it's going to focus on the broader project-based approach as opposed to well-by-well basis. So truly, we think it's revolutionary. Like I say, at some point in time in the future, we're going to draw on societal and economic factors in our decision-making. Right now, we're just building out the transactional foundation. And as we finish that, we're then going to start incorporating some of the cumulative impacts into our decision-making process and the societal benefits and risks in our decision-making. So right now, it's really a foundational building exercise.
So I'm going to jump into some of the nitty-gritty details of how we're going about doing this. So really, this is more than just a new application process. It's changing the way we're making decisions. We're making decisions that are now based on, they're risk-informed. So ultimately, there's an event that takes place in the platform, in the system, and based on the risk of what's being applied for, it would take one of two paths, either an automatic path or what we would call a high risk or a baseline or an additional review. So ultimately what that means is, do any of our technical experts need to look at this or not? And that's sort of a decision point within the system, which then, to go back to a comment that Carlos said, it allows us to maximize that effectiveness of our limited resources, our expertise, allowing them to actually focus in those areas. So what the system does is it has a complex set of rules and validations, both to determine which path it should go on, but also the administrative completeness of that application. Does it meet our minimum requirements or doesn't it? So I'll give you a couple of examples. Maybe first before I go, the risk rules are ultimately based on there's three different buckets that we look at when we develop what we call our risk rules or assessment rules. It's location-based, operator-based, and activity-based. And so maybe I'll talk through a couple of examples just to speak to each of those. So the first one would be, let's say, a sweet gas well on flat, private land where the landowner has actually signed off consent to the activity, and there is no sensitive species in or close by. So that would, when you're thinking of a location, there's no sensitive species, there's no spatial additional sort of requirements that would need to be met. The operator in this case, I guess we could assume in that there's landowner consent. We would anticipate that being good. But if there was an operator issue, that would be taken into consideration. And then the activity, a sweet gas well. And in this example, you would assume, or the example would be that it would meet all requirements and there was no variances requested. So based on that, in the system through the validations and the risk rules would be able to determine whether or not it meets minimum requirements or whether they're asking for any additional variances or putting forward any alternative mitigations. And in this case, they don't. It would not need to be seen by anyone. It would, the computer system itself would validate it and it could be automatically approved. If we look at a higher risk example, something like maybe an existing multi-well thermal project, where potentially there's steam injection into what's a single well bore. Maybe this company has a history of production incidents, and maybe it's in a location where there's some caribou range issues or plans that we need to take into consideration. So again, the information would be submitted into the system, and based on the rules that we would create, whether they be spatially driven or through the data that is actually collected through the screens, we'd be able to determine that based on a number of things in that situation, location potentially, if there was caribou range plans that we needed to consider, operator, if there was quite a few production-related incidents in there, or the activity itself, just the fact that it's steam injection, multi-wells, and into a single well bore. So those three things there, we would actually put that off, and as a result of all the automation, our now very technical staff have more time to actually look in detail at this specific project instead of trying to deal with the volume that exists in the old administrative processes.
So maybe just a couple of comments for the folks in the room that are regulators. This effect that, to be honest, what's happening here is we're stealing ideas from Google and others, and we're preloading with algorithms, and that gives us an ability to introduce other concepts once you've got this build. And what I'm really saying there is the system has a learning capability. It will actually start to pick up depending on where the government or people in positions of high levels of authority send us. So it has this amazing ability to react very, very rapidly. That's the agile piece to this and really the secret sauce. It's only secret in a regulatory space. We just we 3M'd it. We stole it from people that are smarter than us. So that's the key to this actually as you go forward.
Also to note, it is real time. So company is entering in their information and they can validate, and you'll see later on, they could validate page by page. They know whether or not it's administratively complete as they're actually entering it in. They know whether it's going to go which path, whether it's going to be automated or whether it's going to be looked at by our staff right away before they even submit it. So very transparent. And of course, because we know every application is unique, the system doesn't make the decisions for us, but the system does choose the path by which the review will take place or the review will follow. Because we are automating, we have also instituted quite a rigorous back-end audit process. So our first project, our pilot, which we went forward with, was on our reclamation certificates. And through that process, we've done quite an in-depth audit review of both the information that was submitted, both through desktop and field audits, as well as the system itself. How are those rules working? What are the validations catching what they should be? And 100% sort of result. The audit process as well in the field has caught a couple of things that we wouldn't have caught otherwise. But again, because the staff are no longer doing the administrative task, they can be out in the field and actually catch those things. So again, moving us to be a more effective regulator. So what can it do? So really, when we were looking at, again, phasing it in, we were looking at a couple of things. So where are highest volumes, and where are those really high administrative tasks when we're looking at return on investment to get there as quickly as possible. We also had a number of backlogs. There was a question, I forget where it came, but what helped sort of gain the momentum and we had a number of backlogs. We didn't have enough staff to actually meet our timelines. And so that started people starting to, think in an innovative way, how can we actually manage this? So with that, this is what is currently can be submitted through what we call One Stop. So all pipeline applications, whether it's for new construction or the amendments, those are all in the system now. All our reclamation certificates are in the system, as well as all our Water Act approvals, not water use, but water approvals for impacts to water bodies. And as well, we've just added our inspection process in. So now we can interact with industry to gather that information on those detailed site inspections. Paul alluded to the fact that we're phasing this in. Obviously, there's a number of activities that we need to actually put into the system. And as we incrementally step this out, the integration, and really that's where the power of IDA and One Stop is, that integration, that getting to the big project thinking, higher level, being able to look at it and share information across. And so that's, again, as we add more to the system, that becomes more powerful.
So as a regulator, this may sound a little bit different, but we're looking for return on investment on our internal investment. And when we look and transform, we work with our stakeholders. We want to know what the pain points are. So from a regulatory perspective, we want to solve specific regulatory problems, but we also want to know what are we going to get in terms of our ROI. I can tell you that when we first initiated One Stop, we solved it was alluded to here by my colleague, we wanted to solve a huge backlog on reclamation certificate applications. They're in the thousands, and they had been around after we had merged with the other government departments, so we had picked up that legacy backlog. And we did the project within 120 days. This was the first time we tested the technology. We were able to clear out the backlog within, once it went live, within 15 minutes, we're able to issue, based on that risk-based approach, 80% of the applications went routine, and they were approved immediately. But again, on a $1.6 million investment, we're able to ascertain $7 million in direct cost savings to industry, plus another $75 million in deferred costs. So we're looking at what is it that we can save, and what specific business problem can we actually solve. And the cost savings that we get, they're actually verified through our industry associations. They have certain, obviously, business formulas that they apply, and we obviously have our own internal calculations, but for validity and verification, because at some point in time, the Auditor General will come along and say, okay, what have you done? Can you verify this? We actually get third parties to verify the cost savings. So we are looking at efficiency gains. I think in what Shelley was speaking at, to date, we've been able to automate 70% of our applications through One Stop, and I think that's about 4,800 of them as of January 19. Certainly, obviously, you can imagine the staff reduction in turnaround times. We've gone from days and hours to minutes, and we'll just get to some of the stats in a moment. But again, we're also being able to, we have specific timelines on our manual high-risk application turnaround times, so we're sticking to those. So again, operators know that if it goes that non-routine manner, they're looking at 30, 60, 90 days. It's actually ingrained. So we've got service levels with our industry. Again, it goes to certainty of outcome, so they know that it's not gone into a black box as previously. So again, it is about savings, it is about time and money, and it is about ROI. These are just some of the dramatic reductions that we had in terms of reclamations. Certificate applications, again, the whole backlog was eliminated. As you can see, in terms of percentages for high risk, we've had a 75% turnaround reduction, 83% for low risk. Again, and what we've been able to do, there's never been a backlog since we're current. So it comes in, obviously Shelley spoke to the PNOA, PNOD, I mean, if it's approved, they're approved immediately. We hold them for another 30 days because that's a legislative mandate for notice of application, and then they're issued immediately. And we went from, you know, like I say, for 75% of them, we went from over a year of review to literally 30 days. So that's impressive on the high risk. We went probably from 180 days to 31 days. So again, you're seeing that efficiency, that certainty of outcome, and how these things are handled.
That's an incredible reduction. If I could get my calorie count down that fast in a year, I'd be. But any concern at all? Have any stakeholders said, "Hey, you're moving too fast"? I mean, it's still 60 days for a review, but you know, going from 400 to 60, has there been any pushback on that?
There wasn't, surprisingly, and we knew there wouldn't be because, as Kim and others have stated, we do a lot of engagement, both at the design, the build, and the test stage with landowners, with government, with industry. So we actually involve them all the way through the process. It doesn't come as a surprise. And we do focus group testing, all of that. So when we were going to roll this out on the reclamation piece, we actually went to a lot of the NGOs and some of the stakeholders, like our Farmers Advocate, and they basically said, this is a good thing. Issue them all at once. We were thinking of phasing it because we were worried about, is there going to be a backlash from the rural community? Because they get obviously lease payments. And when you get a reclamation certificate, it takes away their lease payments. So they're not getting the money. But, you know, we got full agreement from the communities, get this and keep it going. Because there was a big environmental gain to this. We're able to return land to its original land use capability or very equivalent. So having that environmental, returning land to the land base, that was significant for us too. So no, there was not pushback. So pipelines, again, similar statistics. You know, in the old system, we were putting out pipeline applications. We were doing the authorizations from 6 days. We're down to 2 now. And that's 99% of the applications that come in. On some of the non-routine or the high risk, again, we're going from months and many months to, again, probably a 30-day turnaround. So again, significant reductions in timelines. And again, to Shelley's point, on those, we're only looking at what's triggered the risk rules, and we're just focusing a very focused review of those applications. And that's the critical part. We're not opening it up again. We're not looking at it from end to end. We're looking at the specific risk rules that need to be addressed.
So Paul talked a bit before about really putting a focus on the user experience and really, you know, eliminating a lot of the burden and the annoyance of all the systems that everyone was using. So getting to an intuitive, easy to use system, really focused on information sharing, both internally between teams, but also externally with industry and the public. And as a regulator, taking the guesswork out of it, providing certainty and clarity in what the requirements are and what actually needs to be answered before actually submitting an application. We like to say basically lifting the curtain on that black box, which as a regulator we hear about quite often.
So public access, one of the real neat things about it is we have a GIS component. So as the public, you're able to see in real time as these things are approved, what's pending, what reclamation certificates have been issued. You're actually able to, going forward, to subscribe if you're interested in a given area to see, I want to be notified of all the pending authorizations, pending reclamation application, incidents. So the public has a real view into what's happening in their environment. That's critical. Again, this gives them the ability to see what's happening from a big picture point of view. It goes again to confidence. People know what's happening on the landscape. They're able to assess it, make the decisions that are critical to their own way of whether they want to be involved, whether they want to file a statement of concern or not, but allows them to see what the decision maker is doing. Likewise, when I say public, it also, the industry in the past they could never figure out where the application is in the queue. And right now, the industry folks know exactly as it's progressing to the system because they get notifications. So having that transparency to the public and our industry operators, it's critical. As Shelley has said, it does away with the black box mentality. But more importantly, it goes to transparency, and that's critical for us.
I think next what I'm going to do is we're going to walk through a couple of screenshots. I'll go through them. I won't take too much time because then we're actually going to watch a video that's going to take you through the workflow from the industry perspective. So this here, what you're seeing is just the homepage. Again, the idea here is it's web-based. It should be very intuitive. As an industry or a member of the public, everything you need, whether it be videos on how to use it or how to submit it, or the actual access to the system, you would get to from this page here. So this is just an example of exactly how clear and how concise the information is that we're asking for. So we ask a number of yes-no questions. Those yes-no questions drive the path that those applications are going to take. The other thing that you'll see in the video is that depending if you do say yes or no to some questions, there are additional questions that you'll need to ask or things that you'll need to provide in order to help the manual review in those cases. As well, just wanted to show you guys that left-hand navigation. Just like any of those other web-based tax forms or whatever it is that we use, you can see where you are in the process, and you can toggle between the different areas, just like a normal sort of web-based form that you would use for any other submission type, such as taxes. So next, here's an example of one of our longer drop-down menus. But again, if we have a finite number of choices, we're just going to give them to the industry and allow them to choose what they need to, rather than hoping they spell something right or what have you. See?
Is there an 800 number you can call if you don't understand something on there?
We're producing videos. There is a 1-800 number, but we're producing YouTube videos that people can
some
watch.
Crazy, what you want, is it on the list, or you don't see it? For example, you call it something different than is on your list. Say, hey, I have a spigot. The spigot's not listed here. What do I use?
Yes, and I think that's an important point. While we're making our regulatory process as efficient as possible, it's not meant to remove the human element from the regulatory process. And so for those situations, you've always got someone on the other end of the call or the other end of the phone. So this is one of my favorite ones. So this is what you're seeing here is a list of, it says assessment rules in the middle, but that is basically those risk rules I was talking about. So if you can imagine industry, they've gone in, they've submitted they've entered all their application information, they've validated it all, and now what they've done is they run their risk rules before they submit. So fully transparent, no more black box. This is before they've actually submitted it to us. It's in draft form. They'll see right away whether or not it's going to be an automatic approval or not, and for what reason. And they can then, based on that information, submit it and with certainty know sort of what timeline they can expect to hear back from us with. And the decisions, whether it's an approval or not, published right away as soon as we hit it, and also more accessible. So accessible to the public, accessible to industry, accessible to everybody, as soon as we actually make that decision.
So a couple of comments here for folks from Brookings that are interested in, you're going to hear comments of regulators, how are you making any of these decisions? Like, what is going on in there? Or if you've been in FERC at a senior level, the reality is it's tough to figure out what's actually happening in this very quiet, non-transparent cube. So I think what Shelley's trying to get across here, and I recognize we're into quite a bit of detail, but in behind this, actually, there's a boatload of detail that would bore most of us in this room, actually. The practical reality is, if someone wants to click on a button and say, I don't understand why you issued this, you can actually click on it, and it will say exactly, we considered, here are the 12 factors we looked at, these ones we considered low risk, these ones we considered high risk, and this is the reason we made these decisions. So every decision is defensible up into a Supreme Court. Everything is highly transparent for all stakeholders, and it's sort of driving that. It's not reflected in this, but that's kind of from a philosophical perspective as a regulator, you're desperately trying to get to that, but yet you have a million pieces to process in a year. That's kind of how you do it. That was the idea anyway.
So we walked through some of the sort of key features, and now what we're going to do is we're going to play a video of the workflow. Keeping in mind this is from the industry perspective, and it's going to start after they've entered in their original contact details.
instance, it's new construction of a pipeline on a new license. Next, OneStop asks for additional information about the application. These questions are specific to the activity being applied for. OneStop will also prompt you if more details are required for an answer that you select. Next, OneStop will take you through the activity details of the application. You can see that the drop-down menus continue to guide you along the process, and the yes or no answer format allows you to answer the questions that the system requires. OneStop provides the ability to upload a shapefile containing the spatial data into the system. It only takes a minute or two for the file to be uploaded and viewable on the map viewer. The map contains many layers that you can customize for your viewing experience. Next, you are able to provide the details of the pipeline you wish to build. Again, the use of the drop-down menus allows an applicant to easily select their answers. You can either download the pipe specifications into OneStop via a CSV file, or you can choose to enter the pipe specifications directly into the system. OneStop will not allow you to continue if you've entered incorrect or invalid information, as seen here when the applicant tries unsuccessfully to validate their pipeline. The system will tell you where your error has occurred and why, giving you the opportunity to go back and re-enter the correct information. In this example, the pipe material is not correct. Based on the information you have provided already about the pipeline, relevant technical questions will appear on this screen in the same yes or no answer format. Once all of the information has been collected, OneStop displays the assessment rules and indicates which rules may have triggered additional review. On your landing page, you can view your recent activity in OneStop, including draft, submitted, approved, and denied applications. For this demo application, we can filter the view and can see that it's now moved from the submitted queue to the approved queue. Once approved, the license documents are available for you to download.
So that's an example, I guess, of that's a pipeline example, but we've got a lot more going on, I guess, that we're going to be adding into OneStop, and I'll let
Sure.
Paul tell you about those.
Yeah, I think we're on a multi-year program, transformative program here, and I think the two most critical elements that we're going to tackle next is obviously the methane emissions reporting, which is obviously mandated by government. You heard a lot of discussion about that this morning. By the end of the year, we want to make sure that we have the ability to capture it, know from which specific emissions are coming from, right down to the equipment source. So we'll have that type of capability. So that's something that's very critical to us to make sure that we have that. The other thing where we're going to test the full integration across the life cycle is public land. So we're going to test wells, facilities, pipelines, other infrastructure within the public lands. And that will really prove out the integrative nature of the technology and the regulatory transformation. Obviously, by the time we're done, we want to make sure that we've got transactional automation right across from geophysical right to reclamation and remediation. So it is transformative. It's like I say, we couldn't do it without executive top cover. And again, I think the real win here is the technology is sort of a plug and play. So you can and the way it's been architectured, so you can take well and facilities or something else and literally plug it in with the appropriate risk rules, and it works. And that's the real secret of this, is the ability to plug in different modules as you go along without a whole lot of custom coding. And that's the real efficiency here. So by the time we're done, we're probably going to invest $50 to $60 million and probably an ROI close to $500 million in industry savings. That's just a rough estimate. So it is truly transformative.
Wow, yeah, no, so I've never been on the industry side of the fence and tried to apply for one of these things, but I did tried to get Ontario to send me my driving record, my driver's abstract. I had to fax them, then they had to fax me, and so, and that was just, and I didn't have a bad driving record. It was perfectly flawless.
I'm sure.
But it'd be a shame if you stayed to the end of the day and then didn't get to ask your question. One thing, we do promise to get everyone out on time, but some folks might have questions in the room about the technology, any regulators. Is there any burning questions for Paul and Shelley?
I have a question from industry. How long did it take you to get to today?
So we bought the technology 5 years ago, and we had to start playing with it. We had to really configure it and make sure we've got the appropriate architecture.
Really about a year and a half.
Yeah, from implementation.
And what have you found to be more difficult, the IT part or the workflow with the people behind it?
People.
Definitely the change management aspects. And I would say not just internally, but also on the industry side.
Who owns the software? You guys, or is there a service? So if state of Wisconsin wanted to use it, would they contact you, or is there a vendor that has it? Who's the license?
So we bought the licenses from a third-party vendor named OpenText. They're a world-class technology company.
So if somebody wanted this, they could just contact them and...
Well, yeah, but we own the intellectual property behind that as to how to architect this and build it out. I don't think there's another regulator that would know how to do that. That's the real secret.
Okay.
You can buy the technology, but if you don't know how to configure it, and that was the real discovery by our own teams, is how to put it all together. And that's where we're getting the accolades and the architecture awards worldly, because we figured out what we'll call the secret sauce, that intellectual property to make it all work.
It's basically a technology stack, and the secret sauce is how they interact with one another, not just that you have
The
them
question
all.
is, can you commercialize that?
Yeah, I'll be frank, this is a hot topic internally in the AER from a perspective that, is there something we've got here? So there are patents that have been put on some of this, that's moving now. You can there's about 5 technologies you use, and actually so say OpenText doesn't exist, you just throw in another dynamic case management system. It's the linkages between those things, that's the sort of secret sauce here. And so, yeah, we have patented it, and we are testing it actually in different venues around the world. And the idea of that is, if we can actually sell this, I'll be frank, it will help our government and the industry we're regulating, because it would reduce the taxation burden effectively.
Yeah, question, Martin?
Yes. At least in the U.S., typically government IT projects frequently fail because we want to configure the IT system to exactly match our work process. And it seemed that you pretty much were able to make the system match your work process pretty closely. Is that, or was there a lot of process change? And my agency in particular, we've wasted more than $60 million on failed projects.
So I can,
Go ahead,
yeah.
Shelley.
So a couple of different things. One is when Paul was talking about the coding before, so really that customization. If you think of sort of the technology stack, it's only in the very top layer. The rest of it is not customized. So when you're customizing the screens, it's just in that very top layer. So you're not, it's not, like our legacy systems are hard-coded and you can't get a change to save your life because it's all the way down, whereas this is just that very top layer. We also did a lot of work, years of work in preparation to get to this point, looking at our business architecture before we actually configured the work. But it's done at such a high level at a workflow level that, basically you receive something, you review something, you make a decision, and there's some other output. Like, it's at a very, very high level to allow that customization at the very
And
top.
it's adaptable for changes in that workflow.
Absolutely.
To some extent, I think the answer to your question is probably, it's a blend of both. You got to be able to have some executive leadership say to your working staff, those technical people that are passionate about what they do, they're going to have to flex a bit, but they don't have to flex on the things that are really a big issue, because that would be inappropriate. But if it's, well, I'm used to checking the box, and I have to check that box. Really, are you sure? Why do you need that box? And there's an actual process, a facilitated process with regulatory analysts, people that have like MPAs and MPPs, and you'll walk engineers and scientists and people like this through this process to say, let me understand what that box does. What does that red light blinking do? Oh, it's very important. Extremely important. Yeah, I know. But what does it do? And there's a bit of a conversation like that. But if it's valid, it goes in. But what you'll find generally is you can't replicate like for like. It won't work. So you have to have some pressure from above, right at the very top of the organization, to sort of say, folks, we're going in this direction. And if you're going to do it, you end up not being overly popular at times. So.
And to Shelley's point, the change management was huge on it. Working staff, getting their heads around. But I think the success of the reclamation pilot really, everybody, and especially when the results of the back end audit, because it went through and then everybody went, wow, that was great. So
Definitely help build momentum.
Yeah.
Okay, I see one question in the back. I'm also going to open it to the room. This is your last chance to get your questions in, but these guys will be hanging around too. So if anyone wants to tag on to what Tom Huffaker from Exxon has to say, please do.
I'll just ask this half as a quip, half to so everybody in the room knows his backstory, but also seriously, how helpful was it that you had an experienced armor commander at the top of the house?
Honestly, it was very useful. This is hard freaking work from all sorts of perspectives. I won't, it does, once you get into it and once you start producing the results, it is interesting to sit in a room and to have fairly strong First Nation or ENGO support sitting with industry, and everyone's sort of nodding their head going, yep, we can see value in this. Yep, we agree. There's little things. There are still some things we gotta, but internally it is tough to practically do this work, just like it would be in any of your organizations. It's to use the modern term, change management. It's big, yeah. And it helps having someone that.
Who's the armor commander? Is that Shelley?
That is Jim Ellis, a former combat tank commander.
And that helps every day on every issue.
Yeah, it really does, actually.
I just remember in some discussion years ago, Jim saying, yeah, I know everybody's really stressed out, but for me, any day that no one is trying to, quote, kill any of my people.
That's correct.
It's not that stressful.
Exactly. You do two tours in Afghanistan.
Well, go ahead, Paul.
No, Tom, Jim's really great. I mean, he gives the strategic intent, and then you got people like Tristan and others who protect us, and we just run, right? And it's great to have that. They just give us the latitude to move and get this stuff done. So I think that's another combination, having that executive oversight with that vision and that determination to get things done. It's critical.
What Tom said, any day is a good day when you're not fighting a tank battle, I think. But we can also say today is a really good day. It's beautiful outside. You guys have been a delightful audience. Thanks for staying to the end. That's the way you get invited back to the Wilson Center. And I know I brought up baseball for a reason, too. I think Shelley, Paul, Tristan, Kim, and Sam, who've been just fantastic partners to work with and convene this conversation for the AR. I think they're headed to the Nationals game this weekend. So if you're there in the park and you want to have a beer and learn a little bit more about the technology, come say hi to them, and they'll be around afterwards. So thank you, guys. Give yourself a round of applause, and to Paul and Shelley.
Thanks, Paul.
Oh, you mean the expos? You go see the expos.
That's right.